Hello, my name is Joanna Bourke and I'm Professor of History at Birkbeck, University of London, but also I'm the PI for the SHAME Project, which stands for Sexual Harms and Medical Encounters. And today I'm really thrilled to be able to speak to Aisha Gill. Today, she is Professor of Criminology, University of Roehampton, but has an incredible record with her research, with her activism, and also, of course, with winning many awards. In 2017, she was awarded the CBE and the Queen's Birthday Honours List for services in tackling forced marriage, honour crimes and sexual violence against women. But she's also the recipient of many other awards, including, just to name 3 of them, winner of the Economic and Social Research Council's Outstanding Impact in Public Policy, winner of the Asian Women of Achievement Awards, Professional of the Year, and the Ratan Award, Jewel of India, in the field of education in 2011. Look, thank you so much for coming and speaking to me today. Look, before we start talking about your research, can you tell us just a little bit about your background and education?
Sure. I grew up in the Midlands, come from a very working class background, parents immigrants, and basically grew up in a backdrop of poverty, racism, all sorts of challenges around social exclusion, various hardships. I was, from a very young age, very aware of the pernicious aspect of patriarchy and how it was harmful, particularly to young women like me growing up, where daughter devaluation was very significant, preference for sons. So I exited at a very young age and fielded my way through, trying to find my way in the world, and I used education as a weapon. It was a form of rage against the machine, against the rusted chains of tradition, I didn't have any parents to lean on when I exited, because I grew up in a very conservative community. So Barnardo's funded my A-levels, and that's how I got to university.
Wow, it's an incredible story. Look, you've been working for many years now on health and criminal justice systems, and particularly their responses to women from Black, minority, ethnic, and other minoritized communities. But also, you're unusual in the sense that your reach really is global in the sense. I mean, you not only work in this field in the context of the UK, but also, and I've got a list here, Georgia, Iraq, Libya, India, Pakistan, Yemen. I mean, how did you, I guess 2 questions, how did you get interested in this field, and why such breadth, and what can that give us?
In terms of why this field, the personal is political. It's unfortunately, through tragedy and loss, and witnessing violence, experiencing violence from a very young age, and using that to locate myself, but also at the same time to address a significant lacuna, because my mother's generation, they never had access to support, understanding, or naming that kind of violence. And so I kind of, in her memory, made it my business, to be honest. So the personal was political, and I, was always an activist. So I worked in the communities that I did research in, which I continue to do today. So they go arm in arm. Long before ref and impact became a thing, to be honest. And I guess I was always interested in what was happening in my backyard, in terms of women's and girls' experiences, documenting violence and harm and mental health and self-harm and suicide in our communities. I'd lost quite a few of my peers because they found that there was no way out. So suicide was a solution, but the devastation of that, many of them as a result of violence that they had endured when they were growing up. So I just wanted to document that, but also theorised and, studying at the University of Essex, because that became my home in so many ways, a political home. It nurtured my sociological imagination. It prepared me and fed me and supported me. And not only did it literally provide shelter for me, because I was one of the very few students who didn't go home at Christmas for many, many years. And that was a place where I combined the theoretical with my activism. And I was interested in the intersections of violence and the harm associated with that, in terms of looking at structure, patriarchy, looking at family, looking at how abuse manifested itself in the communities that I came from. And I looked at notions of honour, shame, how they played out on women's bodies in particular, and how they were used as a basis to justify violence. And I wanted to kind of lean in and look at the way in which the social cultural relationships, and, for example, how the ties that bind in relation to the family and community interacted or interrelated with the way in which men, women, individuals who self-identified in terms of sexuality from LGBTQI communities were framed, and when they stood up to the patriarchal systems, how violence was used as a basis to harm them. So from that work, from my PhD work, led to me, developing, looking at the intersections between domestic violence, honour-based violence, and in the most extreme, the murder of women because they're women, and looked at how honour was used as a basis to, both as a form of violence, but also as a basis of challenging change, and flipping these notions on their head in terms of shaming perpetrators, holding the state to account in terms of their lack of due diligence responsibilities. And of course, if you're working in this field, for me personally, it's always been the case that I can't disconnect the activism from the work that goes on. And I developed that particularly first looking at how notions of honour, shame, violence were experienced in South Asian communities, and then that extended out into different forms of violence, not only domestic violence, coercive control, FGM, rape, sexual abuse, child sexual exploitation, rape, and looking at patriarchal power, but also the power of the state, the lack of the way in which the state colluded in the violence, and looking at state institutions in particular, for example, the criminal justice system, which historically, has a long history of failing women and girls, but failing Black and minoritized communities in particular. So you cannot disconnect violence against women from other forms of harms, gender inequality, racism, discriminations, and so on and so forth. So my work transcends both the theoretical and practice, but it's been really important to continue to be a critical friend, and some would say a thorn in the side of the state and criminal justice agencies, because I think, of course, there are challenges with regards to supping with the devil, so to speak, but with it, it's just constantly holding these systems of power to account in terms of lack of impunity, in terms of addressing the pernicious forms of gender-based violence, and that continues to remain the case for me in 2021, as it always has been. So there has been, the work has developed as a result of being called on to give evidence, not only at various, committees at the United Nations, but also in criminal cases and in the family courts. So my work has been instrumental in making the case for looking at the way in which violence is experienced, but how the state then subsequently punishes and responds. So my work takes a multi-pronged approach. It works at different levels, and in terms of it's always been at the core of it, the community work, the activism, translating theoretical ideas into practice, and shifting enabling transformative change. And that work is not easy. It's hard, it's difficult, it is emotional edge work. And I've had my fair share of death threats, because and it has been really, really scary, but that hasn't stopped me from continuing to raise my head above the parapet.
Yeah. One of the things I've noticed about you in the many years that I've been kind of following what you've been doing in terms of research primarily, but also in terms of your activism, and that is that you have this real ability to take very complex concepts such as intersectionality, such as systemic, and actually put them into a language that we can understand, and that we can actually engage with. I mean, I just want to ask you if you can kind of explain some of those fundamental concepts that really go through all of your work, intersectionality, systemic. I mean, you mentioned both of them just now in your talk, but why are they so important, particularly if you're dealing in these kinds of kind of violence?
Well, I mean, I think I've acquired the language through my work, but I mean, I was never a theoretician under any circumstance, and I still get lost in some of those ideas. But I think maybe because I come from an activist background, it's about accessibility, it's about understanding those real lived experiences and applying them accordingly. So I guess, and that's really, really important, because of course violence against women and girls doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's interrelated. It doesn't happen out of the blue. There are all sorts of variables that are at play. So it's really important to look at the situational context of both the micro and the macro aspects in terms of a lived experience, and how that lived experience is motivated by various actors, whether they are actors in the private sphere, that's family members, but also state actors in terms of their complicity, in terms of reinforcing and denying access to those basic fundamental rights, i.e. access to justice, access to services. So if we look at the experiences of Black and minoritized communities and women and girls and those who have no recourse to public funds, it is an absolute outrage, that migrant women are denied recourse to public funds. And it contravenes so many human rights articles, way back from the Geneva Convention, the 1940s, and the right to live without torture, but also the right to have support. And I think you can't look at the experiences of women and girls in our communities in particular without looking at those other variables, that other intersecting aspects that impede and deny and contribute to further violence. Bourke talks about, symbolic violence of the state, and that's something that, if you use that kind of language, of course, it's in the community it's happening. They won't describe it as like that, but they'll say, "This is what happened to me when I tried to get justice." So it's about interrogating those layers and how they are interconnected in terms of understanding the situational context. And of course, if we look at what's happened in the last 14, 15 months, how COVID has had a massive impact. And obviously there's more public engagement now than there's ever before, because, people are having to stop and they're beginning to pay attention. But the thing is, those kind of systemic inequalities and discriminations have always been there. They've always been there. So, of course, COVID has highlighted the devastating impact and how significant health inequalities, and our communities have been saying for years and years and years, what needs to be done. So, how formal and informal justice operates, how all these aspects all interconnect with women's rights, different forms of violence, gender equality, and how do we achieve that? And does that mean you have to disrupt? You have to disrupt the systems of power to enable remedies, not only short-term but long-term remedies. And also that requires, and when we're a thorn in the side of the state as activists and human rights defenders, we are actually also saying, look, your monitoring procedures are really appalling. Your accountability is disgraceful. You speak the language of, a change, but beyond the rhetoric, there's very little, and you're contributing to continuing spites and harms against violence against women and girls. I mean, look what's been happening over the last 4 or 5 weeks. We had the case of Sarah Everard, but there were other Sarah Everards in our communities, women who have died in our communities, but have never received the same level of interest and rage and public response in the same way. And I think, of course, it's important that we use these critical events as basis to say enough is enough. But how many more times? And why is it there's a particular type of woman from a particular type of class, social class, that everyone's talking about violence against women and girls? And that does cause rage in itself, because it just reminds us as activists and working in our communities that the experiences of Black and brown bodies are not always equal. Some cases of violence against women are seen as more profoundly impacting, shaking social responses than others. And that, in my opinion, is an injustice. And that means that our work is even more hard and even more critical. I mean, I think I'm thinking about, for example, the amount of money that was raised by, and that was brilliant, Reclaim These Streets. They raised over 200, 300,000. So I set up in June 2020 a crowdfunder for migrant women who have no recourse to public funds. And the reason why I did that is because Boris Johnson held a committee meeting, and he was informed at that meeting in May last year that, and he was astonished that he actually didn't know that asylum-seeking individuals had no recourse to public funds. And he said that he was going to look into it, and he was going to do something about it. Has he looked into it? Has he done something about it? No, he hasn't. So my friends and I, 2 of my friends, we decided on 29th of June that enough was enough, that we were going to set up our own crowdfunder, and we were going to then donate all the monies. And, as working in my communities, the notion of seva, selfless service, meant that we actually, every single penny that came in wasn't used for any overheads. It went straight to where it should go, to organizations, and it went to buy and for services, because we've had enough of mainstream white services, always historically been an advantage point in terms of funding, securing funding, both short-term and long-term. And the pandemic has even highlighted that even more, because for women and children in our communities, there are few and far between specialist services for them. So we're making our business, and of course we have to work much, much harder, because there is even more of an urgent need because of the harms of the state, of our criminal justice system, and the harms that continue to go on every single day in our families and communities. So yeah, the work is, I don't think I could ever do this work without doing one or the other. For me, it's both. It's always been both equally. And that means if you are doing research, then you have to get it out there back into your communities, and then use it as a basis to hold claim makers, policy mandarins, whatever they're called these days, to account. They have a responsibility. protection for all means protection for all. And that also includes those who are the most vulnerable in our midst. So the work continues to address those serious gaps. Things are not easy because, there's challenges around religious conservatism, the erosion of women and girls' rights, the everyday misogynistic male privilege, entitlement, racism, sexism that have further, harmed our work in terms of trying to reduce violence against women and girls. And that is not reducing because we've had lockdown, we've had schools closed, we've had health services literally on their knees, and we still have a lot of work to do in terms of addressing ineffective and discriminatory policing, gender bias court experience and sentencing processes, ineffective redress for crimes against Black and minoritized women and girls. And so even in 2021, of course, I've been working in this field for over 20 years, both nationally and internationally. And of course, and granted, there have been some real changes, and ripples of change have been really critical in challenging post-code lottery responses to the way in which violence against women is responded to. But we still have a long way to go. And I guess as long as I'm standing, I'll continue doing this work.
Yeah, look, thank you so much for your time. Just one last question, and it comes from what you've just been saying. A lot of people who'll be watching this video will be enraged, like you are, like we all are, about these issues. What would you say to someone listening today who maybe doesn't probably have the experience that you've had? What advice would you give them for how they can change the world for girls and women?
Like I said at the beginning, the personal is political. I mean, I'm a survivor of abuse. I've lived through harm, and that has informed, and loss has been critical to my journey, and everything I do is in the memory of my mother. So I guess any advice is that you build your own seeds of protest and rage and resistance against the systems that you're located in, whatever they may be, start small, don't give up, and just self-belief. And of course, there are going to be countless times when you're going to fall down, and it's finding your inner strength, inner self-belief, which we all work on every single day, to get up and say, I'm gonna keep pushing against the system. I guess that's key, and you will grow your own plants of seeds of hope and for a better tomorrow, whatever that may look like. But you have to chip at it every single day, to be honest, and the work goes on.
Great. Look, thank you so much, Professor Aisha Gill. We're really, really grateful that you've come to talk to us today. Thank you.